Hello, and welcome to the podcast that tries to answer one simple question. What is this thing called film noir? I'm your host, Sergio Angelini, and welcome to Tipping My Fedora, where we discuss movies, books, TV, radio, and much more besides, all from the darker side of the street. Today's guest is my old buddy, John Lehman Riley. He and I used to share a desk at the British Film Institute well over 25 years ago. Since then, his career has embraced photography, librarianship, archiving, teaching, academic writing and editing, as well as journalism, exhibition catalogues, CD and DVD notes, and the like. His work has often focused on film and film music, classical music, and Eastern European culture, and has appeared under the imprints of Cambridge, Oxford, and Edinburgh University presses, as well as Routledge, Greenwood, and others. Highlights include Dmitri Shostakovich, A Life in Film, originally from IB Tauris, which is now part of Bloomsbury, and Discover Film Music, published by Naxos, for which he curated 2 accompanying CDs of excerpts. He writes at johnlehmanriley.substack.com. Our podcast today is the first in a series devoted to music written for film noir and covers the period from 1941 to 1959, what many consider to be the movement's classic period. We had a great time catching up, and I hope you do too. John, it's been a long time coming. I'm really glad you're on the podcast. Welcome to Tipping My Fedora.
Oh, it's great to be here. It's absolutely great.
And obviously, money will be sent in the post. Thank you for saying that. So, all my newbies on the podcast, I ask the same 2 icebreaker questions. And the first one is, what's your definition of film noir?
That's a really interesting one. I mean, I suppose I really think about it as the classic kind of 1940s, 1950s, that expressionist lighting, the incredibly twisty plot, the femme fatale, all of those kind of classic elements. And I understand, obviously, that as you kind of move out to the liminal regions, as an academic might say, other things come in and other things get dropped out. And there's that kind of transgressive element. Crime stories, of course, they are often quite sexy stories, which in the context of post-war, the women returning from working and women being more empowered, that was a kind of an interesting element. Beyond that, there are these kind of, I would say, noir adjacent genres like jazz noir, which we will talk about today, I'm sure. And then, of course, neo noir, which really gave an opportunity to ramp up some of those elements. So, the sexiness and shifting into the region of the erotic drama, the erotic thriller. So I suppose I'm quite purist in that sense.
So with that in mind, what would be, do you think, the first film noir that you saw that really made an impression?
Well, I guess, obviously when I was growing up, there were a lot of great things on TV, great film seasons and stuff like that. And there must have been a noir season, or maybe a Bogart season or something. And so I saw The Big Sleep on TV, which is kind of quintessential. It's sexy, it's an utterly impenetrable plot. Maybe that's one of the things that drives me to be this kind of have this very focused view of what a film noir is.
Now, we're going to talk specifically about The Big Sleep very shortly, but you and I are going to talk about the music written for film noir. So we've decided together on a list of films that we think are interesting, worth talking about. They're not necessarily the best, but we think they're all important and worth talking about. For many people, the first fully formed American film noir is The Maltese Falcon from 1941. Starring Humphrey Bogart and Mary Astor and Sidney Greenstreet and Peter Lorre and many more. We've picked that as the first film to discuss, and it has a composer who perhaps isn't as well known as he might be. So John, tell us a little bit about Adolf Deutsch.
Yeah, so Adolf Deutsch, German heritage, had a great career in Hollywood, and around this time was particularly working on film noir. So he did High Sierra with John Huston in the same year. He did a whole load of film noir. I think one of the interesting things about him, and we'll talk about the different approaches that different composers brought to the genre, having been very purist about what film noir is, one of the things about the film noir scores is that they are incredibly varied. And you might have this idea of a film noir score being slightly modernist, dissonant, orchestral, and all of that kind of stuff. But actually, there's a huge variety. And I like the Maltese Falcon score. This is, I think, a really interesting score. It's a particular approach. It's one of the things that drives it is this motif, this 8-note motif, which is, I suppose you would call it the Falcon motif, which you have right up pretty much in the main title. And basically that becomes the really driving force for the whole score. Now, interestingly, when he was talking about it, Adolf Deutsch said that he didn't want to use a leitmotif approach to writing the score. I suppose you could argue that because Bogart is so dominant in the film, that it isn't a leitmotif. You know, it becomes, like I say, this motif of the falcon itself. Within the score, he does a huge amount of things. Like there's this brilliant one where Bogart is drugged, so it's a cue called Deal. Again, it's one of these very archetypal noir film film score moments where the music kind of slightly loses its balance, so the strings get kind of quite swirly. Harmonically, it becomes very unclear because there's lots of tone clusters and dissonances. The Falcon motif is still in there, you know, kind of concealed sometimes. And then there's this fantastic kind of kick, this stinger chord where Bogart is kicked. So it's a really interesting score in that it sets up some of the things that you will see necessarily in future film noirs, because obviously, you know, being drugged or having nightmares and dreams becomes a big part of some film noirs, and the scores reflect that in a way that I would say, and maybe the Maltese Falcon is kind of setting up a bit of a template for that kind of scene.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly one that recurs over and over again. I mean, and absolutely, you could compare it with the way that Roy Webb scores the equivalent moment in Murder My Sweet, the adaptation of Farewell My Lovely by Raymond Chandler, and several others where there are nightmarish sequences as well, of course. So there's the kind of theremin approach, and but here it's very early days, although there had already been at least a couple of noir films that explored the Jungian and Freudian world, and many, many more would come. It's an interesting choice because I think Deutsch is obviously, it turns out, you know, he was a Londoner and born of German emigres who then moved to the United States, and he was an arranger on Broadway and then eventually gravitated towards Hollywood. And some of his best work isn't always credited, which is that he was studio conductor and arranger and orchestrator on several musicals as well, for instance, as well as the films in which he actually gets credit as a composer. Weirdly, and I think it's virtually his last screen credit, is for Billy Wilder's The Apartment, which is peculiar because he gets a very big prominent credit, and yet the main theme for the film is, of course, a song by
British composer Charles Williams from a British film of 1949. So he didn't even write that bit, but he does arrange it in several important ways throughout the film and writes a number of fun little cues that work very well in that movie. But it's a little peculiar, but it sort of helps to give, in a way, a kind of invisibility to his work. He doesn't have perhaps a signature approach, and yet, as you say, to have an 8-note motif as your primary melody, that's quite a complicated one to do. It is actually unusual. Usually the pattern would be smaller, I think, in films of that era. And so it is, I think, an interesting score where also, of course, it's a film driven by dialogue. So the main title sequence and the sequence when he realizes that Caspar Gutman, played by Sidney Greenstreet, has put a Mickey Finn in his drink, are one of the few moments in the film where, in fact, the music is allowed to be brought to the fore. Some of it just gets buried in the dialogue, buried in the mix, fundamentally. But there is a very good recording of it, isn't there?
Yeah, the John Morgan recording, yeah.
Which is, I think it's a reconstruction, isn't it? I
Yes.
don't think so many of these don't have full scores anymore. And I think that was the first opportunity that I had, listening to that, to probably, beyond the title music, to really appreciate what Deutsch was doing in the film. And yet this is a man with a great filmography, as you say.
To have this single motif, which is driving the whole score pretty much, rather than the approach of having, the Wagnerian approach of having different motifs for different people or different ideas. And yet, even though it's you would say almost a one melody score, it's fantastically varied within that. I think also it's interesting, you talk about Deutsch's history on Broadway and things like that, and that sense of drama comes through, that sense of pacing, even though, of course, he's tied to the pace of the film. But that comes through, I think, with a lot of his work as well. And I think, he did several films with Billy Wilder. So maybe The Apartment was a kind of just a nice kind of, here's a nice easy low ball for you. Because, of course, he'd done Some Like It Hot as well.
That's right. It was the film they did that they did before. Just before it.
Yeah. Which is, again, as different as you could think, even though, you could describe it as a kind of a parts of it as being a kind of a comedy noir. Probably pushing the definition a bit too far. But yeah, his sense of drama is what really comes through, and how to illustrate things. The other thing that's interesting is you think about the fanfare, Max Steiner's fanfare, as being this.
Oh, for Warner Brothers, yeah.
Yeah, the Warner's fanfare, you think of it as being this monolithic thing, which maybe changed over time. What actually happened was that for the Maltese Falcon, Deutsch moved it down a tone to a lower key, which again gives it a slightly darker feel. So even in the Warner's fanfare, you're thinking, okay, so this is a darker film than some other Warner Brothers films.
This seems like the perfect time to talk about Max Steiner.
Yeah.
Steiner is this extraordinarily important figure, someone who for 30 years dominated music at Warner Brothers, having previously worked at RKO. And he was that figure that was crucial to the classic Hollywood system, where each studio would have, beyond its music directors and so on, but you would have one composer who could kind of do everything, who would work like mad. At Paramount, it was Victor Young. At Fox, it was Alfred Newman. At RKO, it was Roy Webb. And at Warner Brothers, it was definitely Max Steiner, who was incredibly prolific. It should be said, he got incredible respect at Warner Brothers. His was, and it is the case in The Big Sleep, but very often his would be the penultimate on-screen credit before the director. not the producer, not the writer. It would be him. It would say Max Steiner, and then it would say directed by Howard Hawks, which is amazing, actually.
Yeah.
If you think about it, quite extraordinary. Warner Brothers did do, I think, probably the best music scoring, in the sense of, apart from anything else, they famously in the 40s, certainly, they were recording their music scores in stereo and always had this amazing sound, even though the films were going to be released in mono. Soundtrack, the orchestral scores were recorded in 2-track stereo, or often more than 2-track stereo. In fact, they dabbled with a version of sort of 3 or 4 point scoring, even though that depends on your definition, which is extraordinary. And yet Maltese Falcon is a film that more or less gets the ball rolling, and it's no longer a prototype. It's kind of, okay, this is film noir, we're starting now. But with A Big Sleep, as you say, it's based on Raymond Chandler. It stars what was now becoming a well-established team of star Humphrey Bogart and Lauren Bacall, who by the time the film came out had become his wife, and they'd already appeared in one film together and would have appeared in 2 more. It's directed and produced by Howard Hawks, a huge name in Hollywood. It has William Faulkner amongst the credited adapters for the screenplay.
That's an astonishing, yeah.
Yeah, and he did several screenplays, practically all of them for Hawks.
Yes, yeah.
But it's a terrific score and absolutely subscribes to that leitmotif approach. I mean, there's very much a main title theme, a love theme, a kind of action theme. And there's also a theme that you associate with Marlowe, which is sort of a investigator theme. And I wanted to start with that because it's sort of played in a very humorous key. It's this kind of bum ba bum ba bum ba ba ba, and it's very peculiar to me because I have to say I love the music, but that bit always throws me out because I think, well, that's not film noir. That's very comedic.
The Bogart character is a kind of a slightly wry, ironic character. And so I think the music reflects that, in that it kind of hovers between major and minor. And I know that the old idea that minor music is sad and major music is happy is a gross simplification, but it hovers between the two. There's that little turn up at the end, the little point at the end. It is kind of a reflection of his character. And I think that's one of the things that Steiner does. And it's one of the things I think that marks him out, maybe from Deutsch. Steiner had that background in drama. He worked in theaters as a music director, conductor, arranger, all of that kind of stuff before he came to Hollywood. So one of the things that he does particularly is it's a much more obviously melodic score. There's that really beautiful waltz, the Love Waltz. But it's also really tightly illustrative, scene to scene. So there's an early in the film, Marlowe goes for a walk and he goes through 2 or 3 locations, and the music changes for each location. He's going to the library, and so you get, leaving the office music, then you get walking down the street music, then you get I'm in the library music. Each of those tiny little, they're not really separate cues because it's a continuous piece of music. Each of those pieces of music reflects where he is. Steiner is much more locked into the narrative. I think Deutsch is much more portraying the general mood often. Steiner is much more locked into the narrative. And he also does, which he did throughout his career, right from King Kong on, this thing of Mickey Mousing, which is making the music reflect somehow what is on the screen. So, you get a dum, 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 which is absolutely in time with somebody walking down the street. You get all of those sort of things. So here, there's this lovely kind of falling harp glissando as Lauren Bacall falls into Humphrey Bogart's arms. And then later on, when he's in a chase, he jumps over a wall and there's a little drink on the xylophone as he jumps over. I mean, it's a much more purely and tightly illustrative score than Deutsch's. And the other thing is, when I was talking about the musical, the harmonic weirdness of that main theme, the major, minor, happy, sad, and then right at the end of the film, of course, you get it, and all of that minor stuff has been swept aside, and it's all in the major, and it's all, oh no, everything's happy, it's good, don't worry.
Yes, because it does in fact have that rather odd last shot, which is in essence the hero and the heroine just sort of looking out the window, almost, isn't it? They're kind of, and it's sort of, yes, it's going to be a new day, sort of thing. Everything is all right now. But in fact, I mean, I agree with you completely, everything you've said, and I love the love theme. I think it's, at some moments, he plays it quite slowly, and it has this extraordinary feel to it, real heft to it. It feels like a grand romance, which you don't anticipate, but it's a lovely melody and it's sort of really beautiful. What's interesting to me is the way that, as you say, in terms of counterpoint, when we get to the setup for the final scene of the film, so we actually have a number of important things happening, but it's the Lauren Bacall character and the Humphrey Bogart character. They're in a car and they're driving towards this house, the one owned by Geiger, who we'd seen at the beginning of the film where the first murder occurs. They're driving towards the showdown. They've gotten away from the gangsters. They're heading now towards it. And so on the one hand, you've got a lot of information. There's a big info dump taking place. But Steiner is also reflecting the fact that this is the scene where, so that this isn't just a boring exposition scene, the two characters profess their love for each other, so it becomes a love story at this moment, overtly. But also there's a kind of chase element, because they have to get there in time. So rhythmically, you have this driving force, which is literally the driving of the car, and you can almost hear the wheels turning in the kind of the Mickey Mousing style. I mean, he was never heavy-handed like Dmitry Tiomkin, but absolutely, he's reflecting literally the forward motion of the scene. It says dum 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 dum, and you can actually hear it moving forward. But it keeps interweaving the love theme. And it really rises to a number of big crescendos. And there's a certain point that you can barely hear it on the soundtrack recording, but you can hear it on the re-recording of it, particularly the one by Charles Gerhard and the National Philharmonic, which is where I first heard it as a score, divorced from the images. There's a bit of organ music being played just in that last moment to give it an extra elevation. And I find that extraordinary. It's very powerful, very strong. It's just bringing all these things together in quite a complex and yet completely accessible way. I mean, Steiner is often thought of as the composer that really sort of invented the Hollywood music score in the sense of how we understand it, in terms of how we understand how it's supposed to work on the screen. He isn't the first, but scores like King Kong were so instrumental in guiding us as viewers into how music would work with images. And he was someone who, I think it was said by several people, that if he could, he would have wall-to-wall music in his films. There would never be a gap. He would have constant music. And so, but I don't know if anyone feels there's too much music in his films, but he's doing a brilliant job here. And it was interesting to me. I rewatched that today ahead of our podcast, and I was just struck by how successful that was, that element of the music. Because The Big Sleep as a film noir does have some oddities. It has a lot of, like several Howard Hawks films, it has a lot of screwball elements to it. It has a lot of guy-girl banter. It has a lot of humor. And visually, because none of Hawks' films have a distinctive visual style. He's an auteur who you recognize because of the way the scene's played and because of the type of characters he deals with, but not as a visual stylist. All his films look great, but this is because he's got somebody really important like Sid Hickox lighting the film for him. And this is a film that was shot entirely in the studio. It's all completely controlled. And there's something sort of fascinating. Even the exteriors are in the studio. There's a point where they pull a car out of the water, and it's all done in the studio tank. And literally this house we're talking about with the big climax of the film, and we see the street, and we see the house, and we see the roof, and it's raining, and it's all done on a soundstage. It's remarkably self-contained in that sense, so wonderfully artificial, but very effective. And yet, this isn't a film with long shadows. This isn't a film with particularly dark psychology, actually. The baddies are baddies, the goodies are quite good. The one character that's genuinely noirish, which is the younger daughter, basically it's the part they changed from the original novel. In the original novel, well, they changed several things, but from a plot standpoint, she's much more central to the resolution of the story, and they completely get rid of that. So this is the sister of the Lauren Bacall character. That does, if you know the book in particular, you watch the film, you're thinking, this isn't going quite where it should. It's all been going in a certain direction, and all the psychology of the characters is to sort of cover up something that this person may have done, but they make it somebody else as the villain, and so it doesn't matter. So you get there. And it works so well that you just ignore all of that. But nonetheless, the tone, you can never get it mixed up with Double Indemnity or Robert Siodmak's The Killers, shall we say, or Jacques Tourneur's Out of the Past. It's not as oniric, it's not as dark, it's not as despairing, it's not as cynical at all as any of those films. But it's marvellously entertaining.
I mean, one of the things I think is very interesting about film noir and music is that, they are often, you talked about some of the exposition dialogue, they can be very talky. And so you've got that inherent conflict of, you need to hear the dialogue clearly, but then the music is doing its own thing, supporting that or whatever, illustrating the scene. Or that's one of the things I think that some of those composers are really great at. Steiner was, for instance, Betty Davis's favorite composer. She always wanted her films to be scored by Max Steiner. And what they will do, what a skilled composer would do, would be to choose an orchestration that allows the voices to come through. So they treat the voices as almost like a separate instrument. So they think, well, here we've got a baritone and a tenor here. So how can I orchestrate around those voices so that I'm not covering them? Oh, here there's a soprano just come in. So it becomes I don't want to push the point to make it sound operatic. But again, those composers who had a history in the theatre, again, had an inherent advantage that they'd been doing that kind of stuff. They dealt with people with powerful voices, weak voices, weirdly high voices, or whatever. And they knew how to orchestrate around that and what to do to best set the text in that way.
I mean, I think perhaps it'd be interesting to talk in contrast to that with the next one on our list, which is the score for Billy Wilder's Sunset Boulevard, the Oscar-winning drama that is still considered a classic, and which has a highly memorable Oscar-winning score by Franz Waxman. Now, he was German composer who had done films in Germany and in France before emigrating to the United States and making a tremendous name for himself with his first American score for The Bride of Frankenstein, 1935. And I don't think he ever stopped being a major Hollywood composer until he, pretty much dropped dead. Quite young, in fact. He was only in his mid-60s. The score he writes for Sunset Boulevard is certainly not anybody's idea of underscore, I think. So that whereas absolutely Deutsch and Steiner could sort of handle the voices and could provide underscore while dramatic scenes are taking place, but you could still hear what they're saying. With Waxman, this is a much bigger, bolder kind of composer. He wrote all sorts of things. I mean, he wrote a fantastically charming score for the Philadelphia Story when he was over at MGM. And in fact, it's the film in which he wrote what would have been for MGM their, what we call it, the music for their logo. But in fact, it only got used for a few films, which is a shame because I always thought it was quite a good one. Newman wrote the 20th Century Fox fanfare. Steiner wrote the music for the Warner Brothers crest at the beginning of all their films. MGM briefly had Franz Waxman's music going over Leo the Lion roaring. But so he could write light stuff as well. But certainly in noir mode, this is a very powerful, memorable, tremendously big score. I mean, I do love it, and it has wonderful elements to it. And obviously, it's a film that famously begins with a very unusual type of narration, because the opening voiceover is from a dead man played by William Holden, who's floating in a swimming pool. And then we flash back and we find out just how he got there.
You see, the body of a young man was found floating in the pool of her mansion, with 2 shots in his back and 1 in his stomach. Nobody important, really. Just a movie writer with a couple of B pictures to his credit. The poor dope. He always wanted a pool. Well, in the end, he got himself a pool. Only the price turned out to be a little high. Let's go back about 6 months and find the day when it all...
What do you think about Waxman's work in general and in this film?
I mean, Sunset Boulevard, I absolutely love. It's one of those films, you know, if you don't know the story, it's about a silent film star who has been really kind of passed over, but she is kind of completely insanely thinking that she's still a great star, and she is serviced in this delusion by her butler. The music, I think, is really, really wonderful at reinforcing and perpetuating her delusion. It's very, very consciously melodramatic 1920s kind of silent film score. So there's a tango with an alto sax, which, you know, you can imagine being the score for a Ramon Navarro or a Valentino film, you know, Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse or something like that. It's a film score which is knowingly melodramatic. Waxman has gone right up to the line and he said, yeah, I can take one step over. And that's enough. I'll just take one step over. So if you listen to the score without the film, it kind of sounds ludicrous and over the top. When you see it with the film and knowing the plot of the film, it suddenly becomes a really brilliant insight and support to the narrative and to the lead character's delusions. I just think it's one of the great scores, not just of film noir. I think it's just one of the great scores, full stop.
Certainly, I know what you mean about the kind of over-the-topness of it, particularly in the climax when we get this Salome's dance sort of added to the soundtrack. It totally works. I mean, it's one of those films that I don't know if that had been done before, but it ends by going out of focus before you get the final credits, you know, which is an extraordinary moment. but which is absolutely, you're going inside somebody's head and their mind is just completely clouded over, literally. But the music rings out and you get this wonderful kind of dance music to go with the Salome theme, which is terrific. This is, of course, the film where Gloria Swanson gets to say, "I'm ready for my close-up, Mr. DeMille," with Cecil B. DeMille playing himself in all his glory. And I agree with you completely. It's a great film. Dark and cynical seems almost unkind, but it takes a somewhat jaundiced view, obviously, of what can happen to people in the Hollywood community. And most films about Hollywood, either it's the road to ruin idea of A Star is Born, or they tend to be lightweight. They tend to be comedic. It's about how Hollywood can help your dreams come true.
Yeah.
This is a film that took a tragicomic view. There is a high level of comedy.
Well, there's almost a campness about it. It looks back on the silent era kind of lovingly in a way, but loving its flaws as much as loving its greatness. The over-the-topness and the excess of silent film, as we popularly think of it. It's kind of in love with that as much as it's criticizing it.
Also, I think Waxman, it's important that he is quite a modern composer. I mean, when we talk about Steiner, even Korngold, who we're not going to get to mention today, but Erich Wolfgang Korngold was, of course, the other great composer at Warner Brothers, but had a very different contract from Steiner's. He sort of did 1, maybe 2 film scores a year. That was it. He was very much someone who came from serious music, worked in Hollywood for a while, and then went back to it. Steiner was someone who I think felt unwell if he wasn't composing music, frankly. It's almost like Richard Rodgers. Richard Rodgers apparently once said that he felt constipated if he wasn't at the piano composing. It's kind of just an extension of his living. He kind of had to do it. And certainly in this film, you get just that opening title sequence, which is this strong, fascinating piece of music that goes in 4 different kinds of directions. And I think it's a fugato, and looks forward to the score he did the next year, which also won the Oscar, which is A Place in the Sun.
Oh, yes.
Which is maybe even better, which is a film that you and I have discussed just because it looks forward does it look forward to Shostakovich or back? I can't remember.
It's very weird that it's just one of those utterly bizarre, coincidental moments where 2 people on opposite sides of the world had the same idea at pretty much the same moment. And so there's this kind of this kind of leaping, running, kind of fuguish, very driven piece of music. And they're so remarkably similar. But I'm pretty sure that Shostakovich never saw A Place in the Sun. And certainly at that point, Waxman had not heard Shostakovich's 11th Symphony. Just a bizarre coincidence.
I mean, equally, it's probably worth saying that given the type of film that Sunset Boulevard is, which has lighter moments as well as darker moments and is set entirely in the Hollywood community of the late 1940s, you do also get a very nice kind of piece of music that Waxman writes for the kind of Hollywood studio type sequences, which are very charming and melodic. And equally, there is a kind of strangulated love theme in there that gets completely bent out of shape, but which has a strong melody that you can absolutely recognize. So it isn't just this ridiculously sort of hard to appreciate score that is too modern for even modern sensibilities today. I think it's very accessible, and yet it's a very well thought out piece of music, and it's not condescending to anyone, and it isn't giving way to any of the obvious conventions of movie scoring either. He's just doing his own thing incredibly well. I do love it. I think that and A Place in the Sun, you can see why they got back-to-back Oscars. I think they are enormously impressive, but this is a guy with an amazing resume. Having talked about a composer who, if he's not exactly imposing himself on the film, is absolutely locking himself into the style and approach of the film and is absolutely in sync with it, we then move on to perhaps the composer that, of all the ones we're going to talk about today from the great Hollywood era, the one who had perhaps the greatest influence even for today's listeners. He's the only obvious one where some of the music he wrote will still be recognized for a variety of reasons. That's Bernard Herrmann. Of a number of scores we could have picked for this primer overview that we're providing on scores for noir films, and we're going to do, I hope, many, many more, John. But the one that you and I have sort of said, let's do it, is a very neurotic film called On Dangerous Ground, which is a police thriller directed by Nicholas Ray, starring Ida Lupino and Robert Ryan, and is a film of two great contrasts. One is the world of the cop, played by Robert Ryan, which is the city, and it's a world of darkness and violence, and is the urban noir nightmare world. And then he has to go out into the mountains, into the snow-capped areas to follow a killer, and reaches the home of this character played by Ida Lupino, who's blind. And she exists in this kind of white world, in the sense of tonally everything is rather barren, but it's snowy and very beautiful and very clean and unpopulated, as opposed to the grungy darkness and heaviness of the world that we'd seen in the city. So it's a score that has these two contrasting elements to it. And also, very unusually, Herrmann, who writes this, I think it is an extraordinary, steely score on the one hand with the most beautiful love theme. Equally, unusually, and again, very typical of him, I think, he insisted on a special credit for the person who is playing a very unusual instrument. So Virginia Majeski was credited for playing the viola d'amore, as we would call it in Italian. How would we say it in English, John?
Well, we'd say it with a bad English, with a bad Italian.
So viola d'amore, would we? Which makes it sound like a movie star. And and she gets it's a 6 or 7 stringed violin, is it?
It's this kind of violin viola type instrument with, like you say, 6 or 7 strings. The interesting thing about it is that below the strings that you actually play, it has a set of resonating sympathetic strings, which you don't touch, but which resonate in sympathy with what you're playing. And so it gives it a kind of a slightly halo-ish quality. It's a difficult instrument to handle. Janacek uses it in a couple of his operas. Really, in the orchestral pit, you never really conscious of it. It's more of a, for Janacek, it's, I think, more of a symbolic than, I think he was just taken with the name of the instrument, wanted to use it. But obviously on film, you can properly record it. And so you get this gentle kind of, like I say, this slightly out of focus, maybe little halo around the sound, which is really beautiful. And it really ties in with the isolation, I suppose, when he goes out to see Mary Malden. But it's one of the things about Herrmann, which again is pushing things forward technically, his fascination with strange instruments. The same year he did this, he did The Day the Earth Stood Still, which is full of theremins. You know, he did the Larry Cohen films where he's using electric organs and all kinds of. He was really interested in strange orchestrations. I mean, beneath 12 Mile Reef had something like, I can't remember, like 12 trombone players or something. Ludicrous.
Yeah, there was that. Also, there was that instrument. Was it the serpent?
Oh yes,
that he used for White Witch Doctor, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, this early kind of, I don't know what it became. I mean, it was like a kind of an early bassoon in a way. One of the ways that he was pushing things forward sonically and in terms of the pure sound of the orchestra. I mean, it's an amazing score. And, in a way, I feel that it kind of gets slightly forgotten in the Herman filmography because people always think about the big Hitchcock films and maybe the Harryhausen ones and things like that. But this seems to me a great score. I mean, there are a lot of pre-echoes of later things. So, the way that the main theme kind of rushes forward and then stops is kind of North by Northwest-ish. Some of the orchestration is quite Vertigo-ish.
Yes, when I was re-listening to it, all of a sudden I was thinking of Vertigo quite a lot, actually.
Yeah. And then there's the galloping hunting scene, which
from Marnie.
From Marnie. I mean, Herman was an inveterate reuser of his own stuff. I mean, a lot of these composers were. When he came to do the opera Wuthering Heights, he dropped in chunks of Jane Eyre and all kinds of other things perfectly validly. I don't think that's a bad thing. So some of On Dangerous Ground turns up in the TV series Have Gun Will Travel.
Yes, I must admit, I'd never noticed that. I read about that, but it's been too long. I used to have an LP of his music from Have Gun Will Travel, and it never struck me at the time, but I don't know if I still have the LP, so I can't prove that one.
Like I say, I think it's an undervalued score of his, which is one of the reasons why, particularly wanted to talk about it, because obviously you could talk about Hangover Square, another great score by him, or Vertigo.
Well, we're going to get there. There's Taxi Driver. There's extraordinary film music. Yeah, not to mention Cape Fear, Psycho.
Yeah, I mean, just within the genre of noir, you could pick any one of half a dozen. And I think, in a way, the reason I wanted to go for this one was that, in a way, it's the most forgotten of his noir scores.
I remember when I would have been 12, I think. When I bought one of my first ever LPs, tells you a lot about me, I dare say, was the classic film scores for Bernard Herrmann album, which was produced by George Korngold, the son of Eric Korngold. And conducted by Charles Gerhard. And the opening track is The Death Hunt from On Dangerous Ground. And I was thrilled beyond all measure. I'd never heard anything as ferocious, as rhythmically adventurous as that in a film ever. And I hadn't, it was years before I actually saw the film. But this wonderful recording done for RCA, beautifully engineered by Ken Wilkinson, and it's fantastic piece of music. I mean, it's sort of 3.5 minutes or something. And that's the bit that tends to get played, I think, partly because because of the album, the full orchestral parts exist. Although the full score was recently reconstructed and re-recorded, I think, is it John Morgan and William Stromberg?
Yes.
I think.
Yeah.
And but it's an extraordinary piece of music. As I say, it's full of this kind of it just sheer steel. I mean, there's this instrument that he used for some of it, which is this kind of, they're almost like two rings that you wear on your wrist, I think, and have to beat together, which again is a very unusual instrument that I think when it gets re-recorded, they don't replicate that, but it's on the original soundtrack. And again, it's just this angry, amazing piece of dense and powerful music to represent the frustrations and the roiling bitterness of this, big city cop. I can't remember if they actually specify what city he's in. And he's just he's constantly on a short fuse, because all he sees is violence and decay around him. And it's this extraordinary, it takes you right into his head, into his soul. That's incredible. And then you, as it were, go out into the wilderness, in the primal world. So you leave the kind of the built up humanity's version of civilization and you go back to nature. And one of the things you get is this magnificent love theme, which I think is called Blindness, which is associated with the Ida Lupino character. And again, it's just this gorgeous, gorgeous theme. Those two contrasting elements with lots and lots of terrific music in between, although it's not a long film, is it? It's only about 80 odd minutes or so. It's one of those ones that probably got slightly shortened because it was one of those films that got caught up in the Howard Hughes regime at RKO, but was produced by John Houseman, who had produced Citizen Kane and so knew Herman of old from the radio days and so on. But I think it's just, I do love that score. I think it's quite extraordinary work.
To me, it looks forward to a lot of his later stuff, which unfortunately is kind of slightly overshadowed it.
Yeah, I'd absolutely agree with that. I think so. It's at least there is now a decent CD of it out there for those who buy CDs. There's downloads as well. And the film itself is available in an excellent Blu-ray from Warner Archive. So recommend to anyone to buy that. It's got a very good audio commentary by Glenn Erickson, who writes column as Cine Savant. He used to be DVD Savant, but it's well worth getting. Leaving Herman aside, we can now move to someone who who knew Herman but had a slightly interesting relationship with him, which is David Raksin, who for a long time worked at Fox as a kind of staff composer before he got his big chance. And his big chance was Laura. We talked about including Laura because it's a major film noir from 1944. But although Laura is a lovely song, albeit clearly modelled, it seems to me, on Duke Ellington's Sophisticated Lady, which in fact it replaced. They wanted to use Sophisticated Lady and they couldn't agree on it. And I think there was probably a licensing fee issue as well. So he was a staff composer and they asked him to come up with something. The song's an evergreen. Johnny Mercer wrote lyrics for it. It's part of the Great American Songbook now. It's a lovely song. As a score, it's disappointing, it seems to me, because my recollection of it is that the entire score for the film is just simple variations on that song. And none of them are very dramatic, are they?
Yeah, it's a bit... obviously a lot of film scores are essentially modeled in that way. A lot of film scores are essentially, here's one or two melodies, and here's a variation on the first one, and here's a variation on the second, and here's another, and here's another, and here's another, and here's another. That kind of goes with the territory, and certainly, some of the films we could talk about and will talk about take that as their model. It just seems to me that the variations in Laura are not incredibly inventive.
Yeah, I mean, they work for the film, but if you just listen to them as music, it doesn't seem to get you very far, it seems to me, which is why we picked an incredibly minimalist score, but one with a sensational theme song, which is The Big Combo from 1955. So this is 11 years after Laura, and Raksin is coming up with a score of a very different type. I mean, it's very brassy, it's super jazzy, a bit of big band. I feel like maybe, is it a bit bebop? I'm not sure, but it has this wonderful bounce to it. It's an extraordinary piece of music.
It is. And I suppose around this time, we're talking about the early 50s. Yeah, jazz is coming in, and jazz just coincidentally kind of echoes some of the things that you think about as being classic noir elements. So it's modern, it's urban, it's slightly dissonant, so there's a kind of a slightly disconcerting quality to it. And so the jazz noir developed, as I say, as this kind of subgenre, and you can think about loads of them. Again, we talked about a few, and a Big Combo is one of them. The other thing that is, I think, interesting about the possibility of a film noir is a jazz noir is that the music can become much more integrated into the narrative. Some of the really great jazz noir scores, really, you're drifting in and out of the narrative by means of the score. The score suddenly becomes, oh, it's diegetic. I thought this was score, but no, it's not. It's part of the narrative. And again, that's kind of plays into that unsettlingness of the genre, I think.
Well, this is certainly borne out by the next film we're going to talk about, which is the 1959 film Odds Against Tomorrow, which was directed by Robert Wise and once again stars Robert Ryan as a deeply troubled individual, this time playing a crook, and it has a score by John Lewis. So who's John Lewis?
So John Lewis was a member of the Modern Jazz Quartet with Milt Jackson, Percy Heath, and Connie Kay. So Lewis wrote this extraordinary score, Odds Against Tomorrow, for, in fact, a much enlarged group. It was a 22-piece band with the quartet at the center, and then he got in people like Bill Evans on piano, Jim Hall on guitar, and Gunter Schuller playing the horn. Now, Gunter Schuller is maybe not a particularly well-known figure now, but Gunter Schuller was a leader of what was called the kind of the third way, which is the idea of integrating popular and jazz, other genres, into the concert hall. And of course, you think about, some of the things like Leonard Bernstein did, say, like Prelude, Fugue and Riffs, music, indeed, even for On the Waterfront, things like that. That was one of Gunter Schuller's things. In fact, he ended up teaching in London. And so Odds Against Tomorrow is, again, really kind of dark score, which again becomes part of the narrative. And then the other thing about it is that it became, really successful
As an album, as an LP.
as an LP. So you think about, I mean, Miles Davis, sure, he did, Ascent to the Scaffold. He did it in concert sometimes. I mean, not with the film, but as music. Anatomy of a Murder was really,
That was Duke Ellington, yeah.
Duke Ellington,
Who
again,
appears
I
as
think
himself, of course.
appears as himself. So there's this whole kind of like ambiguity about what are the limits of the narrative. Again, we think about Nightmare from 56, where Meade Lux Lewis turns up as Meade Lux Lewis, and again has a jazz background.
We should say up front, John, because we haven't, but one of the reasons why we're talking about this like this is because one of the things about Odds Against Tomorrow is this was the main star of the film is Harry Belafonte. And Harry Belafonte plays a vibraphone player in the film, and we see him actually play that in the film. We actually see him perform in a club. And I don't know, actually, if what he plays there, he's not playing with the quartet, is he? He's not playing with the MJQ on screen, I don't think, right? So, yeah. But so just to say, because we've made a point of saying it's diegetic, we haven't said how. So in this case, the lead character, while he's a thief, and this is a story about a bunch of criminals who are going to basically rip off a bank, and it all goes wrong, mainly because the Robert Ryan character is a racist and can't manage to keep that in check once Harry Belafonte joins the gang. The thing about Belafonte is that when he's not doing that, he's actually a musician, but he's got money problems.
The musician dragged into crime is a kind of a common enough element of these sort of films as well. Obviously, I think Lewis regarded this as, it was more than a gig. It was more than I'm doing a film score. They released the album, they would play it in their concerts, so he really invested in it as something that was not only part of the film, but that could have a life beyond that. Which again, at this point, film score culture didn't exist so much. So again, people would record Laura, the song, but nobody would really record like the whole of the film score. And so Lewis again was moving into a world where, the film score is something that is valuable in itself as a whole. And yet at the same time, obviously, when the Modern Jazz Quartet did it in concert, they couldn't reproduce the 22-piece orchestra. So it was the film score, but it wasn't the film score. So it's kind of just all very interestingly ambiguous in that way.
It's a terrific film. And I think the music is very much part of that. And in a way, it's interesting. Obviously, we associate it to a certain degree with the Belafonte character because he's the musician. And nonetheless, I think that it is part and parcel of the movie. And we're coming to the end of the classic film noir era, depending on your definitions. But that's all for another time, John. So, look, I wanted to just thank you very much for part one. And this is going to be continued very shortly on this Bat Time and this Bat channel. So thanks very much, John, and talk to you in a sec.
That would be lovely. Thank you.
Thanks.
It's been great to have the impetus to relook at a lot of films and even discover a couple of films that I wasn't really aware of or knew about but hadn't actually watched. It's been great prepping it, and it's been lovely talking about it.
To be continued. Thanks very much, mate. You have been listening to Tipping My Fedora, the show about all things noir. It is produced for Castiglione Publishing by me, Sergio Angelini, and our theme tune is by Petar Milinkovic, whose work is available through Tailkeeper Music. All audio clips are the copyright of their respective owners, and used under fair dealing and fair use exceptions solely for the purposes of criticism and review. Please subscribe to Tipping My Fedora wherever you get your podcast fix. And it would be great if you could leave ratings and reviews about the show at Apple Podcasts. Be seeing you.